You know who Al Capone was? You watched Scarface? You watched The Untouchables? You saw the sharp-dressed man with the cigar, the scar, and the overcoat. You know Elliot Ness took him down. You know he was the criminal mastermind. You know how he died. The problem, almost everything you know was made up. And the 23 facts I'm about to show you are going to tear down every layer of that myth. Fact 1. Nobody dared call Al Capone Scarface to his face. Here's something people don't know. The famous nickname Scarface was created by Chicago newspapers, not the underworld. On the streets and behind the scenes of the mob, anyone who said that word near Capone would probably leave in a coffin. Al Capone himself hated the term. He preferred telling reporters that the marks on his face were war wounds, earned fighting for his country in World War I. A lie. Capone never wore a uniform. The truth is simpler and more humiliating. In 1917, at 18 years old, he was working at a bar in Brooklyn and made a crude comment about Frank Galluccio's sister. Frank pulled out a pocket knife and slashed his face 3 times. Capone carried that shame under his skin until the last day of his life. Fact 2. He was born in Brooklyn, not Italy. Here's something that'll surprise you. Al Capone, the man who became the symbol of the Italian mafia in America, never set foot in Italy. He was born on January 17, 1899, in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, yes, were immigrants from the Naples region, but Alphonse was American on paper, raised on the streets of New York like any other kid in the neighborhood. He spoke fluent English, with that thick Brooklyn accent, and barely knew the Italian he heard at home. So why did everyone see him as a foreigner? Because prosecutors and newspapers at the time painted that image on purpose. It was easier to convict a dangerous Italian than to admit that the country's biggest criminal had been born and raised right there inside the United States. Fact 3. Here's something that'll surprise you. The man who moved millions never finished elementary school. Al Capone dropped out of public school PS 133 in Brooklyn at 14 after slapping a teacher in the face. He was expelled that same day and never set foot in a classroom again. But pay attention to what comes next. When the FBI finally got their hands on his accounting books, government experts were stunned. They said Capone's financial organization was, quote, comparable to a Fortune 500 company. All learned on the streets through trial and error, managing rivers of dirty money from alcohol, casinos, and protection. A kid with no diploma running an empire that would put a lot of Wall Street executives to shame. If that fact surprised you, just imagine the next one. Leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Would you have the guts to work for Capone? Fact 4. Capone was running 161 businesses at the same time. Here's something that'll leave your jaw on the floor. In 1927, at the height of his empire, Al Capone ran 191 speakeasies across Chicago, plus 35 betting houses, 14 casinos, and a bunch of brothels nobody was ever able to count properly. On the payroll, 1,000 men worked for him, not to mention the hundreds more who depended on the operation on the side. The IRS calculated that the money coming in reached $60 million a year, close to $1 billion in today's money. And now comes the part that irritates any honest American who pays their taxes on time. Capone didn't report a single cent of it to Uncle Sam, not one nickel. That arrogance was exactly what planted the seed of his downfall. Fact 5. Everybody knows the story of Elliot Ness and his untouchables taking down Al Capone. It became a movie, a TV series, an American legend. But the person who actually put Capone behind bars was a guy almost nobody knows. Frank Wilson, an IRS agent who spent his days going through receipts and accounting books. Capone was convicted in October 1931 for tax evasion, not bootlegging or murder. Ness and his team never managed to prove a single crime directly tied to Capone. In fact, Ness was left out of the IRS investigation because they thought his group was too loud for work that required silence and patience. The most revealing part is that when Ness wrote his book in 1957, telling his version of events, the IRS itself refused to review the manuscript. The reason? They considered it fiction. Fact 6. He opened one of the first soup kitchens in the U.S. When the Great Depression wrecked the American economy in 1930, millions of families had nothing to eat. And who showed up to help? One of the most wanted criminals in the country. Al Capone opened a soup kitchen on Chicago's South Side that served up to 3,500 meals a day, all paid for out of his own pocket. It's estimated that he spent between $70 and $100 a day, a fortune back then. Most Chicago newspapers treated it as nothing more than a publicity stunt, but what few people knew was that Capone grew up going hungry in Brooklyn. He knew that reality up close. Historians who studied the case later confirmed there was something genuine there. Chicago's most feared gangster was doing what the government itself couldn't. Fact 7. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, something changed inside Al Capone. The man who ran Chicago started living with one constant fear: being poisoned. He hired someone just to taste every meal before he ate it. He only drank from bottles that were opened right in front of him. When he traveled, he brought his own cook because he didn't trust anyone anymore. No plate reached his table without being inspected. And here comes the part few people know. When he was arrested in 1931, one of the first things Capone negotiated with the authorities was permission to receive food made by his own wife, Mae. America's most feared gangster wasn't afraid of shootouts or the police, but he couldn't sit down to dinner without wondering what was on his plate. Fact 8. Before February 14, 1929, much of Chicago tolerated Capone. He handed out soup to the unemployed and kept the city running behind the scenes. But that day, 7 men connected to Bugs Moran were executed in a garage. The detail few people know is that internal records suggest Capone didn't directly authorize the attack. His subordinates acted on their own. And that changed everything. Public opinion turned against him overnight. President Herbert Hoover personally called J. Edgar Hoover and gave a direct order: take Capone down. The man who operated in the shadows now had the federal government spotlight aimed at him. One single day of violence destroyed years of careful strategy and turned a businessman of crime into a national target. Fact 9. Think about this. Between 1920 and 1930, Al Capone was arrested 6 times. 6. And none of those arrests led to anything serious. It wasn't because there wasn't enough evidence. It was because Capone had judges, prosecutors, and police chiefs in his pocket. In 1911, government estimates said he spent around $75 million just on bribes. To give you an idea, that was more than the entire annual revenue of the Chicago Police Department. The whole city, in a way, ran under his control. Police captains took orders from him, not from the mayor. Capone didn't need to run from the law. He just opened his wallet, and the law looked the other way. It took the federal government getting involved for someone to finally pin something on him. And even then, it wasn't for murder or bootlegging. It was for income tax. Fact 10. The guy who ordered killings without blinking went to Mass every Sunday. Al Capone considered himself a practicing Catholic and made a point of going to church, often with a pistol hidden under his suit. He had images of saints all over his house and office. But it went beyond faith. Capone consulted a numerologist before making business decisions, as if they were a strategic advisor. The number 13 was his personal nightmare. He refused to attend any meeting with exactly 13 people in the room. Once, he received information that he would be assassinated on a Thursday. The result? He stayed locked in his room all day and didn't go out for anything. The attack never happened, and to him, that only proved the superstition worked. The man who controlled Chicago with an iron fist lived in fear of forces he couldn't see or control. Fact 11. Al Capone caught syphilis in the very brothels he controlled, probably sometime between 1920 and 1925. Treatment existed back then, arsenic-based, but he refused to get treated, partly out of pride, partly out of shame, and that decision cost him dearly. The disease kept advancing silently until it reached his nervous system, what doctors call neurosyphilis. Over time, Capone started losing the ability to think clearly, to plan, to make quick decisions. By around 1930, his own men could already tell something was wrong. They started acting on their own, without asking for permission. The boss who ruled Chicago was becoming unable to rule himself. It's ironic when you stop and think about it. It wasn't the police, it wasn't his rivals, and it wasn't even prison that started destroying Capone. It was a disease he could have treated and chose to ignore. Fact 12. The tax evasion conviction took 5 years to build. Here's something few people know. The man who brought down Al Capone didn't use a gun. He used a pen. Frank Wilson, an IRS agent, started digging through Capone's finances back in 1926, half a decade before the trial. Wilson and his team spent endless nights going through more than 2 million documents, all by hand, with no computers. In the middle of all that paperwork, they found 12 transactions showing money going into the boss's accounts with no explanation at all. Wilson also managed to flip 3 of Capone's former associates who agreed to testify. In October 1931, the verdict came down: 11 years behind bars and an $80,000 fine, the largest ever handed down for a tax crime in the country up to that point. Fact 13. In prison, he led an orchestra. When Capone arrived at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 1932, he didn't just sit around. Before long, he put together a band made up of other inmates called the Rock Islanders. Capone played the banjo and took rehearsals seriously, 3 times a week. On weekends, the group performed for the rest of the prison. The prison warden himself, A.C. Aderhold, even described Capone as a model inmate during his first 2 years. But that phase ended fast. In 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, the most feared prison in the country. There, everything changed. His money and fame meant nothing inside those walls. Even worse, other inmates saw him as a chance to build their own reputation. Capone, who had once run all of Chicago, now had to watch his own back just to survive another day. Fact 14. When he arrived at Alcatraz in 1934, Capone found out that money couldn't buy anything on that island. 0 privileges, 0 special treatment. The guards treated him like any other inmate. In 1936, another prisoner stabbed him. But what really destroyed Capone wasn't the physical violence. The syphilis he had been carrying for years started slowly eating away at his brain. Guards began reporting disturbing scenes. Capone would talk to himself in his cell, arguing with people who weren't there. He believed he was still in Chicago running his crime empire. In 1938, at just 39 years old, he was transferred to a prison hospital. The diagnosis left no doubt: advanced dementia. The man who once controlled an entire city could no longer control his own mind. Fact 15. In November 1939, while the world was preparing for war in Europe, Al Capone walked out of prison with no fanfare. The man who had once controlled all of Chicago was released early because his health was destroyed. The syphilis he never properly treated had advanced so far that his brain no longer worked the way it used to. He went straight to a mansion on Palm Island, Florida, where he spent the last 8 years of his life, practically hidden from the world. The newspapers that once devoted huge headlines to his every move barely ran a small note about his release. But the most disturbing detail is what his own family later reported. At times, Capone didn't recognize the people around him and acted like a 12-year-old child. America's most feared gangster ended his days fishing in a swimming pool, completely lost inside his own mind. Fact 16. He died, practically without a penny to his name. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone took his last breath at 48 from cardiac arrest made worse by pneumonia. And here's what almost nobody told you. The man who once moved millions a week in Chicago died with less than $100 in cash to his own name. Everything that was left was tied up in real estate in Florida. The crime fortune, it had been spread among relatives and front men to avoid federal seizure. Meanwhile, his former partners rode the wave of Prohibition's repeal in 1933, became legal liquor distributors, and got rich without having to hide anything. Capone, locked up at the wrong time, missed the party and missed his place in history. Fact 17. Capone's most famous quote? He never said it. I bet you've heard that line before. You can get further with kind words and a gun than with kind words alone. Everybody swears it came out of Al Capone's mouth. Well, brace yourself. He never said it. Not once. I looked through trial transcripts, newspaper interviews from the time, personal letters. Nothing. Zero. The quote only appeared in 1967, 20 years after Capone was already buried. And guess where? In a play. A screenwriter needed a hard-hitting line for the character, made it up, and the world bought the story. Funny to think about, right? Chicago's most feared gangster became known for words that came out of some random writer's head. The legend often weighs more than the real man. Fact 18. Here's a twist few people know. The famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, was set up by Al Capone with one clear goal: to wipe out Bugs Moran, his biggest rival in Chicago. On that freezing morning, 7 men from Moran's gang were lined up against the wall of a garage and gunned down without mercy. But here's the detail. Moran never walked into that building. He showed up late, saw what looked like a police raid at the door. It was the gunmen dressed as cops, and turned around on the sidewalk. Later, he told a reporter, "Only Al Capone kills like that." The strangest part? Capone was in Miami, with an alibi on paper, while his men were doing the dirty work more than 1,000 miles away. Fact 19. The government knew everything and did nothing for a decade. This is the kind of thing that sounds fake, but isn't. Since 1921, the federal government had already had detailed files on Al Capone. Bootlegging, extortion, links to murders, bribing politicians. It was all documented. And what did they do with that information? Absolutely nothing. For 10 years, it sat there collecting dust in office drawers. The problem was technical. Almost everything Capone did was a state crime, not a federal one. And at the state level, he had judges, cops, and prosecutors in his pocket. The federal government simply didn't have clear jurisdiction to act. It took IRS agents coming up with an idea no one had tried before, arguing that money from illegal activity was still taxable income. It seems obvious today, but back then, it was a completely unheard of move. America's biggest criminal didn't fall because of violence or bootlegging. He fell because he didn't pay taxes. Fact 20. In May 1929, something happened in Atlantic City that changed American crime forever. Al Capone brought together bosses from 7 different cities at a seaside hotel. Nobody had ever done that before. The idea was simple: stop killing each other and divide up the territory like businessmen. For 3 days, these guys negotiated operating zones, agreed on prices, and created rules for settling conflicts without bloodshed. Capone, at just 30 years old, ran the table. What came out of that meeting laid the groundwork for what the FBI would decades later call Cosa Nostra, the American Mafia, organized on a national scale. But here comes the part nobody expected. 2 days after the meeting, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia. The reason? Illegal possession of a firearm. The man who had just redrawn the map of crime in the U.S. went down for carrying a revolver in his pocket. Fact 21. Mae Coughlin married Capone in 1918. She was 21, he was only 19. They had a son, Sonny, who was born partially deaf because of congenital syphilis passed on by his own father. Now think about that. While Capone lived surrounded by violence, money, and newspaper headlines, Mae stayed behind the scenes, in silence. When he was arrested, she visited him regularly. When he got out of prison with his mind destroyed by syphilis, Mae was the one who took care of him for 8 straight years, day after day, until his death in 1947. What's striking is this: she never gave a single interview, never wrote a book, never sold a story to a newspaper or magazine. She lived until 1986, reaching 89 years old, and still refused to speak publicly about her husband until her final day. At a time when everyone around Capone was chasing fame or easy money, Mae chose absolute silence. Fact 22. When Al Capone died in January 1947, the New York Times buried the news on page 14. In that same edition, the death of Grace Moore, an opera singer few people remember today, got front-page coverage. The Chicago Tribune, the newspaper of the city Capone practically ruled in the 1920s, devoted only 3 paragraphs to the story. Think about that for a second. The guy who moved millions during Prohibition, who commanded an army of gunmen and bought politicians like him people buy cigarettes, became a footnote in his own city's newspaper. America had moved on. World War II changed everything. Nobody cared anymore about a syphilitic gangster who could barely put sentences together. Real interest in that era only came back decades later, when historians started digging through the archives. The man who dominated Chicago for a decade died forgotten, demented, and irrelevant. Fact 23. Hollywood invented a movie version of Capone to hide the Capone the American system created. In the movies, he shows up as a criminal genius, a one-of-a-kind guy who built an empire on his own. Scarface, The Untouchables, Boardwalk Empire. They all tell the same story: an extraordinary man who challenged America. But the reality was very different. Capone wasn't an exception, he was a consequence. Prohibition made something illegal that millions of Americans still wanted to keep doing. Politicians voted for the ban and kept drinking behind the scenes. Cops took bribes because their salaries couldn't compete with bootlegging money. And poor Italian immigrants with no access to decent jobs found in organized crime, the same path rich families took behind the scenes of politics. A Capone who's a genius becomes entertainment. A Capone who's inevitable becomes a mirror. Hollywood always chose entertainment because the mirror is way too uncomfortable.